Hello, and welcome to Raising the Bar with the MBBA. I'm your co-host, Adeola Adejobi.
And I'm Jason Clark, president of the Metropolitan Black Bar Association. For those of you who aren't familiar with our organization, the Metropolitan Black Bar Association is the largest association of predominantly African American attorneys in New York. Our goal is to advance equality in the pursuit of justice, assist in the professional development of our members, and address legal issues affecting New Yorkers.
The goal of Raising the Bar with the MBBA is to foster a substantive conversation about justice issues in our community and to try to identify a couple of solutions in the process.
Today, we're going to take a deeper dive into rent stabilization and protecting tenants from harassment. Joining us today are the Honorable David J. Bryan, Judge of the Housing Court, and Candace Carponter of the law firm Candace C. Carponter, PC. Welcome, and let's get to it. So today, as we were mentioning, we're talking about rent stabilization, tenant harassment. I think especially because for this show, this is our first landlord and tenant-centered program. Why don't we start with a little bit of a primer as to what rent regulation is?
The most relevant rent regulation at the moment is rent stabilization. Rent stabilization came into being as a remedy to a problem of the market. After World War II, a large number of veterans were returning to New York City, and you had a large number of people who were chasing a finite number of apartments. When you have that and an open market is working, what you will have is an escalating rent going up to a point where these people cannot afford a place to live. New York City and various other places like San Francisco, I believe Chicago as well, determined that that was an outcome they didn't want to have. So they, at that point, created what was known as rent control, which was a control, for want of a better term, on the rate of rent being raised. As time has gone on, rent control has given way to our current rent stabilization scheme, which also has a series of restrictions on the pace and the amount of what rent can be raised to. And this is today quite a battle as to the scope and the amounts of the increases in rent that will take place. And as I was reading in the New York Times this morning, to the point where state troopers had to go into the state capitol to keep people in order over it. There's very little that people get as emotional about as how much am I going to have to pay for my rent.
Right.
Mm-hmm. What I would just add to that is there still are a few rent control tenants in the city of New York who have been in their apartments since prior to 1974. They are primarily protected by a different structure of rent increases, similar rent regulation, and then anyone else after that period of time, if they were in a building that was six or more units, became rent stabilized. Since that time, there have been thresholds in terms of what the rent would be when you would start in rent stabilization. But for the most part, if you were in a building with 6 or more units, you should suspect that you are covered by rent stabilization.
Yeah.
One of the issues to keep in mind is that a lot of the same purposes in the origination of rent regulation still exist today. Very often when you see science fiction, you see cities that are stratified where there is a almost heaven-like place in the center of the city, and that there are really horrible neglected areas that are on the outskirts. And part of what rent stabilization attempts to do is to prevent that from happening. That if you can keep pricing in the center of the city within range of a middle-class family, that essentially you will have a more diverse community that's not just racially diverse, but economically and culturally diverse as well. And that is, to some degree, still at work in New York City. I'm currently sitting in the Bronx. The Bronx is probably, in a lot of ways, the most affordable county in New York City, and there is a large rent-stabilized and even some rent-controlled apartments that remain in the Bronx.
And so what would you say are some of the benefits of rent regulation?
Affordability for the tenant, a predictability. It's not just about the rent, it's also about the fact that you have a right to a renewal of the lease. Many people here in New York, because we have such a low vacancy rate, if you've ever had to try to find an apartment, You know how traumatic and difficult that can be. If you want to be able to raise a family, you want to know that when you put your child into that school, that you're going to stay in that school district, that you're going to be there for several years. And the right to renewal of the lease in a rent-stabilized apartment gives you that type of stability in the household. And then never forget that rent stabilization is not there alone. There's also the housing maintenance code that the city has in place, where we insist upon a standard of what a apartment should have. This covers issues such as lead, mold, even to the scope of the modern problems such as bed bugs. It has evolved to that area as well. So one of the things that I feel very honored as a judge of the Housing Court of the City of New York is that we enforce those regulations, both those having to do with the rate of the rent, as well as making sure that the standards of the housing are such that people have a decent place to live.
I think one of the most important benefits of rent regulation is the right of family members, both traditional and non-traditional family members, to succeed to the tenant of record's rights. And so when that tenant moves out or passes away, the family does not have to be relocated, is not displaced because of the passing or the move of the tenant of record. And I think that is huge. It is the subject of a lot of litigation, but it is huge. And it really depends on what benefit the landlord can get by getting a vacancy versus by having the tenant stay in place. And that's one of the things that's up in front of the legislature right now.
Right, and just so our viewers are clear, that applies to rent stabilization and rent control?
Correct.
Okay.
There's a little bit difference in the family members that are protected, but primarily it is the same.
Okay.
One of the more interesting things about that as well is when I first started as a lawyer in legal services in 1998, my first challenging cases were succession rights cases. And the issue that you really started seeing very early on were non-traditional families. And one of the first times early in my career, I dealt with the question of a gay couple who were together and one passing and the other one needing to secede. That essentially, even though at that time it was not possible for them to marry and thereby have that type of state-sanctioned relationship, there was a body of law that evolved before we did anything else having to do with recognizing gay marriage that said that secession could go from one partner to another in a gay relationship. And that was what, late 90s, early 2000s or so?
No,
yeah,
way before that.
Okay,
yeah, no,
okay.
I was back in Chelsea. I was back in Chelsea in the 80s, and 2 Associates versus Brown came out of our office, I think probably in the early 80s, even maybe the late 70s.
All right, I'll stand corrected. But I think particularly at that time it was important because that was the time in which the HIV epidemic was really still in full throat. And people who were staying with partners and helping them through their last days were being kicked out of the apartment because they weren't family members by blood and they couldn't marry. And the legislature and the courts did step in and create and recognize that type of relationship.
Right. So a lot of what I'm hearing, I guess just to summarize for our viewers, is that some of the benefits of rent regulation has to do with succession rights, has to do with the right to renew your lease so you can stay there essentially as long as you would like, and some type of check on rent increases so that it doesn't just spike to some limit where you wouldn't be able to afford to live in that apartment anymore.
And that's true not only with regard to a particular tenant, but between tenants. There's controls on how much a landlord can increase the rent after a tenant moves out. And that is what the legislature is grappling with right now, is trying to protect those rent-stabilized apartments from being removed from rent stabilization because either of the high rent that they charge when they do renovations or because of some other reason that the landlords concoct. But that is the primary benefit. It's keeping the rents consistently low in that apartment, not just for that tenant.
Right, and actually, before we move on to the next part of this, I do want to at least try to make sure we crystallize what's the difference between rent stabilization and rent control?
Just when the tenants came into possession. It's really that simple. Rent control, most tenants who were in their apartments prior to 1974 rent controlled. Some had to be there prior to 1971. The law changed a couple of times, but for the most part, it's prior to 1974.
Would you agree that many people in the public would identify it as the little old lady who has the apartment on Central Park West for $200 a month is not rent stabilized? She's rent controlled.
She's definitely rent controlled.
Okay.
And all of her children and her children's children who've stayed in the apartment because of succession rights.
But actually, but that makes a lot of sense because, when you have an apartment that's significantly less than market rate, it's important to be able to keep that because then obviously there's a lot of money that isn't going to, other bills that you have. So especially if you're someone who is who does not have a large income, being able to have affordable housing is an important issue. And it's because of that, it does seem like there has been a rise, at least in consciousness, of these issues of tenants being harassed, right? Tenants who are in apartments and believe that either their landlords are trying to figure out some way to, I believe, harass them to the point of leaving their apartments so that they can be able to use it for other things. Can you speak a little bit about that?
Well, I can talk a bit about that. I can also talk a bit about what comes in the door most of the time. What comes in the door most of the time, and back up just one second, there is in the housing court what's known as an HP part. An HP part is the part that flips the script. Normally when you come to court, your landlord is bringing you to court because you owe that money, or because you didn't renew your lease, or because you're smoking in your apartment and you're not supposed to, or any one of a number of things. So it's typically the landlord dragging you into court. The HP part is the inverse. In the HP part, the tenant is bringing the landlord to court. And essentially, for the most part, the tenant is bringing the landlord to court because of repairs. And they're enforcing the Housing Maintenance Code, and the city actually is a party to that. HPD, Housing Preservation and Development, actually comes to court, sits there 3 or 4 times a week, all day, and helps to adjudicate these cases. I bring it up to say this. There is a statute that's called the Harassment Statute. And in the Harassment Statute, people have the ability to complain they're being harassed. Now, what you were just talking about is what the legislature actually had in mind, which is we have a large class of buildings in neighborhoods such as Williamsburg, where they were formerly very depressed areas but have since become white hot. And there is a great motivation to drive people out because you can move people in who have large rents that you could put in place. So the motivation on some unscrupulous people were to harass people to leave. And they would do this by allowing the buildings to become run down. They would do this by having people knock on the door 3 or 4 times a day and say, I'll give you $500, $600, $1,000, $5,000 to leave. And this developed so much over time. Tenants organized, petitioned, and eventually came to a series of statutes that prohibited that from their landlord. However, today, that is not what people come to court under harassment for. They come to court for harassment because they want their neighbor to stop playing the music so loud. They come to court for harassment because their landlord is actually striking them. They come to court for harassment because there's an issue with regards to the super who is making salacious remarks to them. And as a judge, I'm the first one they see. They bring a petition to me and they ask me, would you please sign this petition so I could start my case? 9 out of 10 times, I'm having a tenant leave there sorely disappointed because the statute does not cover harassment, even though it's named harassment. When your landlord lays his hand on you, when your super says something inappropriate to your wife, there are a ton of other agencies that you can go to. You can go to the Human Rights Commission. Most of the time you should be calling the police. There are issues with regards to simply enforcing the maintenance code. Those things all work. What does not work is the harassment statute. And people will come to me and say the worst stories about being harassed, and I'll have to say, this is harassing behavior, but it is not harassment under the law. And the problem we find is that people do leave the courthouse with what I find the most disappointing thing, which is not that I lost my case, but that the court system failed me. because what they really want is they want somebody to go downstairs and tell that guy, please turn down your music, because the police won't do it, the landlord won't do it, and I should be able to do it. And frankly, I can't.
There is, I think, a form in which some of those, not all, and I think the music of your neighbor is one that's a much harder issue to address, but DHCR, which is Division of Housing and Community Renewal, does have a process for filing a harassment claim. And the way they handle it is a little bit more negotiated, and they have a little bit broader purview, so that they will, if a harassment claim is filed for any of the reasons the judge says, call everyone in for a conference. And to the extent that they are able to get everyone to agree to a form and pattern of behavior going forward, they put that into writing and everybody signs it. And so it has a better impact and a broader range than the housing court harassment claim that you can file in the HP part. And I've seen it work, I've seen it not work, but I've seen it, I think having the ability in a smaller setting to air your grievances for more than 5 or 10 minutes has been very beneficial to a lot of tenants, even if it doesn't rise to the level of formal harassment under the DHCR statute, which is a different statute than the one that Judge Bryan operates under.
And taking it a step back, for those who actually have issues where their landlord is harassing them in terms of trying to get them out of the apartment, how would our viewers know where to be able to file a claim or get help? Because a lot of times people just don't know.
Well, if we're talking about the example I was giving, say, for instance, in a Williamsburg situation where you're trying to clear a building or a series of buildings, yes, it is possible that you could bring that in my part. It's also possible that you have, as an organized group of tenants, the ability to frustrate the landlord when they're trying to do certain construction work by denying them what's known as a certificate of no harassment. That can be very strong motivation, and it's most effectively done when tenants organize together. And when they do that together and they bring all their claims into one place, there are quite a few remedies that are available. One of the more effective is what's known as the 7A statute. In the 7A statute, the court has the ability to appoint an administrator to take over a building, use the rents and other resources to be able to restore the building to an appropriate level, eradicate the various violations of the housing maintenance code that are there, and then eventually, if appropriate, return the building to the landlord's control. That can be very effective, and also harassment can be addressed in that context. Right. But I do think part of what we're doing here is that we're thinking about this entirely on a tenant-friendly level. And it's not. Remember, almost all the cases that are brought in the housing court are being brought by landlords. And they're being brought for, in very simply speaking, 2 reasons. One is you owe me money, and 2 is you have acted so badly one way or another that you don't deserve to be here anymore. Those 2 things are, respectively, a non-payment and a holdover. And most of what the housing court does is to adjudicate those things. 95% of the cases that come to us are settled through a informal but enforceable agreement that's called a stipulation, that's handwritten in housing court. And 5% of them we actually do the Jack McCoy and a Law and Order type of trials, where we come in, we take evidence, we make decisions, we write decisions, and we write far too many decisions. But it's all the trappings of every other court. And people get that. But 95% of people come here, they either get their money or the landlord gets possession of their property, and people move on with their lives.
I would say, I would add just a couple of things to that. One is that I absolutely agree that the most effective way to combat harassment is to get your neighbors involved as well, because normally harassment is not directed at one tenant, it is directed at an entire building. And if you are able to knock on your neighbors' doors and have a meeting, and then reach out to a variety of organizations that represent tenants groups, or you can pool your money together and hire a private attorney. But I think that is an incredibly effective way. Having represented both landlords and tenants, the best way to get a landlord's attention is to have a group of tenants make a decision to either withhold rent or to bring an action in the HP part, or to bring a 7A proceeding. My major concern about any of that is when tenants decide to withhold rent, what I have seen far too often is that tenants don't hold their rent. They spend their rent. And so when you actually get a 7A administrator in, if that was your goal, or you actually get to court and get your repairs, then a good number of the tenants in the tenants group do not have the money to pay the rent, and they lose their apartments anyway after a fight. And that, to me, is one of the saddest things I see happen. So it's really, really important for when you're withholding the rent to literally withhold the rent as opposed to spend the rent. Now, and I'm going to say it's in the last 2 years, because of initiative of Mayor de Blasio, we have far more attorneys to represent tenants who have to come to housing court either collectively or on their own. And that is an essential resource because being in court with an attorney is a far different experience than being in court alone.
I would also add on to that is that it's part of the same pattern that we started this discussion with, is that the city of New York is a place where we've made a decision that we're going to take care of the least of us. We're going to take care of everybody. And yes, people get lawyers, but more than that, it has become a adage within the communities in New York City of what's known as the one-shot deal. The one-shot deal is a grant from public assistance that often helps people to pay the money that they can't pay for their rent. And there are also various subsidies that will assist people who are unable to pay their rent on an ongoing basis, that maybe the rent is $1,500, but your income allows you to pay $1,000. That the city will assist you in paying the other $500. That is part of who we are as a city, is that we're not comfortable with seeing 40, 50, 60, 100,000 people out on the street because they don't have an apartment to go to, and we want to minimize that as much as possible. So that, yes, I think that what Ms. Carpenter is talking about is a reflection of who we are as a city, and our government has decided that we're not going to tolerate a city that has an unlimited number of homeless people. And we're trying to find ways as best as possible to be able to balance that out.
Because I've even heard, we've heard a lot about that, the fact that the homelessness rates have skyrocketed to rates where we haven't seen them since the Great Depression.
Yes.
And we're already almost out of time already, but one thing I quickly did want to ask about is, let's say I am a tenant and I do feel like I'm being harassed in some type of way, and I'd give them I'm claiming I give them my rent checks and they aren't cashed, and for whatever reason I'm always being brought into court, and at least to me seems like frivolous or baseless. Also, it's like, what should someone like that do to protect themselves? Because usually, if that happens, you end up having to leave work. You have to use resources. Like, what would you tell someone like that?
Well, Shakespeare always said that one of the greatest curses you could give someone is a lawsuit. And
a lawyer.
Yes, and I can't really take that away from you because it is a blunt tool. I often get the problem where people feel they can't come to court because they're faced with the Hobson's choice of whether they lose their job or they lose their apartment. And, unfortunately, I have seen it happen all too many times where someone who could have saved an apartment ends up losing it because they can't take the time. But I will share with you that we do find that we have a structure where we have places for people to get advice within the courthouse, and that's impartial, that's manned by a court attorney who doesn't have, as we would say in the South, doesn't have a dog in the hunt one way or another. They're just there to give you the advice that you need. And an example such as what you're talking about also may have advised you that among the causes under the harassment statute that could sustain a case is repeated frivolous cases that are brought against you. And maybe they help you to be able to lay it out, to say, well, that qualifies as a frivolous case, or although you paid the money, you did owe the money when you came in the courthouse, so I can't really say it's frivolous. I mean, one of the things that the housing court does do is that it makes law real for everybody. And all too often, people feel when they interact with the law, I don't know why I got messed over. And we do our very best in the housing court to make sure it may not work out the way you wanted, but you're not going to not know why it worked out the way it did. So that's best I can offer.
I would just have a quick follow-up question. You talked about resources for tenants in terms of organizations that can help them. Do you know of any of the names of those organizations or anywhere on the web that people can find them?
There is, if you go to the Housing Court website, I believe there's a drop-down where it does have organizations you can go to. I do think, however, that the best place to go is, as the judge says, to the court, because I think they've changed the system somewhat. And I think there are a lot of legal services organizations that no longer can take direct cases. They have to take them through the housing court.
Okay.
And so I would say they have a list. They will give you the list. They will make the direct referral. And so the best thing to do is show up at the housing court in your neighborhood or in your borough.
311 is really a great resource of that as well. They are very good at being able to tell you where to go.
Yeah.
Okay.
And I quickly add that I know that there are certain agencies like the DHCR's Tenant Protection Unit, as well as the New York State Attorney General's Office has been doing a lot in bringing lawsuits against folks. So that may be other resources to look at.
Yes.
All right, well, that's our time.
Yeah, already.
I know. Thank you for watching Raising the Bar with the MBBA on the Manhattan Neighborhood Network.
See you next time.